I'm Ros Atkins. Welcome to World Have Your Say. Well, all week long, the situation in Libya has been the biggest story in the world. And two issues have been dominating the comments that you've been sending in to the BBC. First, what should happen to the Gaddafi family, and in particular, should they be allowed to go into exile in some circumstances? The second issue, off the back of that big summit in Paris yesterday, is what should the world do to help Libya? Some of you are saying absolutely nothing at all. Wherever you're watching BBC World News, you're welcome to take part in the conversation. We're live. You can call us, text us, email us, and if you're tweeting, use the WHYS hashtag. And in half an hour's time, we're going to be discussing if the banks deserve to pay for their role in the credit crunch. You're talking about this after a New York Times report that's claimed that the US government is about to sue certain banks for their behaviour in 2007 and 2008. But before we get into both of this week's conversations, let's bring ourselves up to date with the latest headlines, starting with Turkey, which has expelled the Israeli ambassador and suspended all their military agreements. This comes after Israel refused to apologise over its military action at a flotilla bound for Gaza last year. Israel said it acted in self-defence. The European Union has said it will impose a ban on oil imports from Syria. EU diplomats and officials argue the move will put pressure on the Syrian authorities, this after their violent crackdown on anti-government protesters. Libya's leaders are promising elections within months, but Colonel Gaddafi has urged his supporters to fight a guerrilla war against what he's calling the occupation of Libya. There's further evidence of the slowing of the US economy in new official figures. These show there was no increase in the number of people with jobs last month. Share prices in New York have fallen in early trading, and Europe's main stock markets reacted by slumping sharply. The anti-secrecy website WikiLeaks has released its full archive of US embassy cables online. Many, if not all, of the posted documents appear to be unedited, exposing names and details of informants. WikiLeaks took the decision after files became available online due to a security breach. Let me introduce you to our first three guests. Hafed Al-Jawal is a Libyan-American based in Washington, D.C. Ali Al-Safar is a British Iraqi, and he's a Middle East analyst. He's live with us from London. And with us from Paris is Arnaud Castagnet, a communications consultant. All three of you, welcome to World Have Your Say. Let me read you this email we received here at the BBC from Victoria in Jos in Nigeria. She says, "We're so sick of people coming in the name of democracy and taking away what belongs to us Africans. Enough is enough. We can solve our problems given the chance." Well, all three of you, let's hear you respond to that. Hafed first. How do you justify, if you can, the ongoing involvement of Russia, China, Britain, France and America in Libya's future?
I think a lot of people are involved in Libya's future, and rightfully so. I mean, Libya is a part of a global community. Its people, for centuries, have always had all kinds of links with Africa, with the rest of the Middle East and Islamic world, with Europe. They needed help. They've asked for help. The world responded. I think rightfully so, and I am, as a Libyan, I'm grateful for the help that the international community has provided. Where our other countries have decided they want to side with those who are killing the Libyan population. I think what is important is to recognize that this old dialect and this old discourse of Western colonial powers in the Arab world or in Africa is no longer viable. People in their own countries who are really looking at a way to live a decent life and to be a part of a global community, I'll no longer listen to that.
Let's bring in Ali on this, see what he thinks.
Well, I think I would agree with everything Hafid just said. And interestingly, what we heard from Colonel Gaddafi in the last day or so was that he's fighting against the occupation, and I think that's a very deliberate use of the term, the narrative of occupation proved to be very powerful in Iraq, for example, where it allowed an insurgency to start up and be very, very effective. And I think what he would hope for is for that to happen in Libya. But apart from that, I think what Hafid was just saying is absolutely true.
So both of you, in your different ways, making your case for the big countries in the world, France, Britain, Russia, China, America being involved. Arno, you're in one of those countries, you're in Paris. And what's your view of this?
Yeah, I totally agree. Africa should be able to solve this problem by itself, even if African Union has been pretty slow to react to the massive killings. But on the other hand, the NTC has called for NATO intervention, and also with all the refugees coming to, all the refugees from Libya going to France, Italy, and other European countries, and also the US had to react and couldn't do like nothing was happened just in the south of Mediterranean Sea.
But all of you, the point that is being made by many of our viewers and listeners in Africa is that Africa's not even being given a chance to sort this out. The big powers of the world haven't stood back even for a moment. Maybe Hafid, you could pick up on that.
Yes, I'm sorry, but you know, the reality is, let's be very, very truthful with ourselves. I think the greatest thing Africa or the Arabs or whoever you want to choose need to do is really look at reality. We've created our own problems. We never solved a problem in Africa or in the Arab world. The fact that Libya asked for the world community to intervene doesn't mean it's France or England or the UK. Let's not forget that there are a number of other countries who are helping Libya, including Arab countries, including Islamic countries. I mean, yesterday, the conference in Paris had 60 countries attending to support the Libyan population.
Well, you're quite
moving
right,
forward.
But not every country was there. 60 were. South Africa decided not to go. They say it's time to let the Libyan situation play out before interrupting it. If you're watching in South Africa, do you agree with your country's stance? Wherever you are watching, whether in South Africa or elsewhere, do call us up. It's country code 44 2070 83 72 72. I was struck by Hafid's phrase. He says, we're good at creating problems, we're not good at solving them. Is that too harsh on Africa, I wonder? Well, let's bring in Ala El Houni, who joins us from Benghazi. He's a journalist there and works for a radio station as well. Ala, if you could speak to those 60 countries in Paris, what would you ask from them?
Well, first and foremost, I would thank them for attending, thank them for their commitment, and thank them for being involved in Libya. I would let them know that the stages we passed were just the beginning stages of this revolution, that now we're entering into another very significant stage, and we'd ask them for their continued support and their assistance, of course. And that aid and assistance, in my point of view now, as opposed to just being a military or no-fly zone or NATO type of support, should extend beyond to a more proactive helping us grow as a democratic country. We got to understand, Libya for 42 years has been under a completely autocratic regime. And now we're going to be going through some growing pains of becoming a democratic country. And as much aid and assistance and support that we could get into growing into that new system of government, we would appreciate, of course.
And Anna, I'm sure you're aware, there's a huge global interest in what's happening in your country. We're just getting calls from Mauritius, Nigeria, Australia, Sudan, and from inside Libya itself. Arno, you're in Paris. I wonder if you want to take this opportunity to speak to someone live in Benghazi. Is there a question you would like to ask Ala?
Yeah, hello, Hala. I would like to ask you a question because in this conference that has been organized in Paris, some big countries in Africa as South Africa and also in the Arabic world as Saudi Arabia haven't been involved. I think they refused to come and they refused to discuss with the NTC. So do you believe the fact that those two big countries that can play a very important democratic role in the next in the future of Libya, do you believe the fact those two countries were not involved might be a very important problem or not for the NTC?
Hello, Arno. Thank you very much for your question. To be honest with you, we would appreciate their support. We would appreciate their involvement, and we hope that sooner or later we will get it. But for now, I think we have a lot of support. We have a lot of involvement. We have the US, France, UK, Europe, other significant Arab countries, as well as other African countries that are supporting us. I personally believe that we are not to blame any country for not getting involved. We are to thank every single country that has been involved up till now. And we are welcoming the aid and support of all other countries as well. And we hope that sooner rather than later, we will start communicating with them, and we will garner their support, their assistance, their guidance, and more important than anything else, their brotherhood and their friendship.
Okay, good.
And Hafed in Washington, D.C., I wonder if you've got a question for Allah in Benghazi.
No, the question for Allah in Benghazi is how does the population now in Benghazi feel about what's happening in Tripoli and Sirte, and how do they propose that their experience in terms of the transition, which happened 6 months ago, in terms of transition from violence into order and security, how would they be able to help the other parts like Tripoli, who have just gone through it last week?
I think you bring up a brilliant point, Hafiz. I think that's one of the most significant points that people might be overlooking, and I think you're absolutely right. It is a critical issue. There is a few differences between Benghazi and Tripoli. Tripoli has a lot more of a reconciliation factor in there. They have been under 6 months of occupation, of war, while Benghazi only experienced that for a matter of 4 days. One thing that has happened already is there have been members of community, of civil society, and even members of the NTC that have moved to Tripoli to try to aid with that transformation and try to aid with this particular process based on the experiences that they've had here on the ground. But I do believe that it is a little bit of a different situation, it is a little bit of a tougher story, but we hold our hopes up high. Benghazi right now is ecstatic about what's happening. They're very, very much in touch and in tune with what's happening in Tripoli. And in fact, what you'll see has been happening and will be happening is a large amount of people from here heading over there to support and aid during this period. It's not enough to just get Gaddafi out of his seat. There's a lot more work to be done. And as you're saying, towards security, towards minimizing revenge killings or crime in general. We hope that we can take the lessons that we've learned here and help implement them over there.
Allah, thank you very much indeed for answering that question. Hafed, I appreciate you asking it. Those of you watching, if you want to tweet as you watch, use the WHYS hashtag. We're going to take a break now for a couple of minutes, but we'll come back to carry on talking about how the world should get involved in Libya's future. The BBC's World Have Your Say is a place where people come together to talk about the issues, events and experiences that matter most to them. It's live on BBC Radio, online, and now every Friday it's here on BBC World News. And while we may provide the platform, the issues that we discuss are the ones that you're already talking about. This isn't about us interviewing you, it's about you talking to people around the world.
A lot of the power of the programme comes from, say, a taxi driver in Moscow being able to talk to a farmer in Uganda about the same subject. We've taken the programme around the world to many different places. South Africa during the World Cup, we were in Beijing during the Olympics, and we were in Haiti immediately after the earthquake.
Foreign aids need to know that there has always been corruption in this country. Make sure everything is distributed the right way.
Right people.
I'm hoping that World Have Your Say on the TV will recreate the atmosphere of the radio and the online site, a gathering together of people around the world to talk in a civilised atmosphere and share ideas and experiences.
These guys are our brothers and sisters, and they have nowhere to go. They have made mistakes along the line in the past. We just have to forgive them.
We want to make World Have Your Say as accessible as we possibly can, so we're not short of contact details. You can phone us up now. The number's country code 44 2070 83 72 72. Of course, we're on Facebook and Twitter as well. Our email is worldhaveyoursay@bbc.com, or you can text us from anywhere on country code 44 7786 20 60 80. And we know that some of those contact details aren't the snappiest, but don't worry, they're all at worldhaveyoursay.com. We're looking forward to hearing from you. Well, we're talking about how the world can help Libya, and we're not making an assumption that it ought to. Some of you are saying don't offer any help at all, and we're getting an absolutely extraordinary response from you. We've had calls from Canada, Saudi Arabia, Jamaica, Greece, Uganda, Gambia, Kuwait, Germany, Zambia and Pakistan, and that's not even the full list. Joining us live at the moment is Ala in Benghazi. We're also joined by Ali, a British Iraqi who lives in London, and also by Prashish Mistry, a South African writer who blogs at wookie.com. Let me read all three of you this tweet from Stanley in Toronto. He's tweeted us here at BBC World Have Your Say. We should help rebuild infrastructure, train police, provide food plus medical supplies, and keep UN forces on the ground until the loyalists and the rebels can live together. Now, Pratish, let's first of all talk about infrastructure. Would you support South Africa spending millions, even billions of rand, helping to build roads and train routes in Libya?
Well, I think South Africa has sufficient public infrastructure problems of its own, but certainly where I think the biggest contribution South Africa can make is in terms of process. Basically, South Africa has gone through this, and South African people have led the transformation of South Africa from an apartheid-era regime to a democratic South Africa. So certainly in terms of governance principles and things of that sort, that's probably the largest contributions that South Africans can make in terms of.
Okay, so you're saying focus on governance, not so much on infrastructure. Ali, Iraq received billions and billions of dollars to help develop its infrastructure. Would you recommend the same for Libya?
Well, they're in totally different spheres of existence right now. The Iraqi experience was one where there was sanctions for over a decade and war for over 3 decades, and so it was in a different situation altogether. I think much of the aid that does come into Libya will not necessarily have to focus on infrastructure. The Libyan oil sector is operating or will be operating in a relatively short space of time, and that can fund quite a lot of the infrastructure development. And I agree with our guest from South Africa that a lot will have to go into institution building. The state in Libya was one that was centered around Gaddafi and wasn't necessarily conducive to any sort of longer-term development. And I think the Libyans will be able to finance their development, but might not necessarily have the capacity to carry that through because of the lacking institutions. So any aid, any sort of help that can be given should probably be given in that sphere.
And Ala in Benghazi, the second part of Stanley's point was that the UN should put troops on the ground to maintain peace. Now, we know the NTC has rejected that idea. Where do you stand on this issue? Do you need help keeping the peace?
If you want the honest truth, I actually agree with the NTC. I think we do need help maintaining peace, but it should be a lot more of a proactive than a reactive approach. I don't agree with having foreign troops on the ground. That might actually just aggravate the situation. I think what can be done, though, is we could receive guidance, advice, and expertise on security measures, on how to make sure that we're putting adequate measures in place. We could get training as well. Above and beyond that, additional proactive measures that can be worked toward, that can work towards reconciliation, that could work towards the reduction of crime. I think there's a lot of other mechanisms that can be put in place that could help stabilize the country that is not related to putting military power on the ground.
Okay, well, Ali, let's give Ali and Pratish a chance to respond to you. Pratish, let's talk about this security issue. Do you want to respond to what Ali was saying? I'm happy to sit out for a few minutes here.
No, I certainly agree with the bulk of what he's saying. I think the one thing that the Libyans need to be aware of as well in the NTC when they take control here is that there are a lot of guns floating around, and this is one of the reasons why possibly South Africa is in the state it's in right now. There needs to be an active drive to collect the arms and so on, and quite early on in the process, as soon as the NTC kind of becomes a more formal institution, in order to maintain the security on an ongoing basis. But in terms of foreign troops involvement, I think it should definitely be a Libyan-led initiative, and should they request, should the NTC request that kind of assistance, then certainly, by all means, the UN and the African Union and so on should cooperate with them.
Ali, let's bring you in as well.
Well, I think I'd agree with the previous two guests, and add to that the approach needs to be a double-pronged one. As well as the physical security that needs to be kept on the ground, there also has to be reconciliation, or the move towards making sure that even people who were loyal to Gaddafi they don't feel like they don't have a stake in the new state. And that is key. If these people feel that they have nothing to lose, then that could drive people towards insurgency and towards violence.
You're all saying you agree with the idea of keeping troops out, but aren't you making a huge assumption that security will arrive in time? There's no evidence that it will happen. If you look at other countries who've been through similar transitions, we normally end up with a very serious security situation.
Well, the NATO forces were able to come in to react very, very swiftly when Benghazi was under threat. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that all foreign troops need to be pulled out immediately. That's for the Libyans to say and our Libyan friends to comment on. But what I am definitely saying is that while there is obviously the security aspect and the need for physical presence on the ground, there is a need to also marry that with a proactive approach towards reconciliation.
Well, I wonder what those of you watching think about this issue. The NTC has said we do not want UN peacekeeping troops on the ground, but lots of you are emailing saying that would be a good idea to maintain security. If you want to comment on that issue, it's country code 44 2070 83 72 72. Some of you are calling from Ghana, Afghanistan, Somalia, Egypt and Kazakhstan. Keep those calls coming. Even if you don't get on the air, we'll summarise what you've told us and put it up on the screen on the graphic that you can see just to the side of me. Let's pull up another email to put to our guest. Perez in Kampala has replied to the World Have Your Say daily email saying, the biggest help the international community can give Libya is to capture and try Gaddafi. Transition will take time, but I trust the NTC. They have a heart for Libya. Let's keep monitoring. Allah in Benghazi, if Colonel Gaddafi is captured, would you like him tried outside of Libya, as that gentleman is suggesting?
Well, I think perhaps what we could do is have a fair trial for him. Now, the question is, will this be done in Libya or will this be done internationally? Personally, I agree with both, as long as he does get a fair trial, as long as he is tried in front of the people, and it helps bring the people some closure. I think that the gentleman that sent the email is absolutely correct. Libya is in need of some closure. Libya is in need of seeing Gaddafi held accountable for his actions. And till now, as he is evading and he is not available in the public, that does create an issue for us. And I really hope that in one way or another we are able to capture him. But I believe that a good signal would be for us to try him under a fair basis.
Okay,
whether
Alan,
that is in Libya with the assistance or oversight.
Let me interrupt you. I apologise. It's only that Orlando has called us. He's watching us in Libya. We've made a good phone connection, and that doesn't happen so often. So let's speak to him while we can. Orlando, if Colonel Gaddafi is captured, what would you like to happen to him?
Actually, I would say the leaders now will know what they can do to Colonel, because as me, I cannot do anything about scandal or something like that. What I need is my protection, and the security is going to be tight for us to just walk and get what we need to go back to our land. That's it.
Orlando, are you Libyan or are you from elsewhere?
Actually, I'm not Libyan. I'm from West Africa, but now I cannot dislike I'm from Ghana or something like that, because my parents are just dead for a year, and they just told me I'm a Ghanaian, but I don't know where I'm from. That's it.
Well, Orlando, thank you for calling us, and best of luck. And Hafed the accounts, and we've just heard this one live from Orlando, from West Africa, of West Africans being targeted by rebel fighters is a concern, isn't it?
It is a major concern, and it is something that they need to stop immediately, and they need to rely on international experience and international organization to help them go through it, because it can seriously. I mean, at the end of the day, the NTC and their supporters can be held accountable internationally if this continues. If I may, 2 points I want
well,
to.
Well, actually, Hafed, we're just coming up to a break, so a quick single point from you, if you would.
From South Africa, we learned we need how to reconciliate, the process of reconciliation. The lesson from Iraq is not that we need money, but we need how to spend that money and be very vigilant on the procurement process. These are the two lessons I have from South Africa and Iraq.
Well, we appreciate you making that point and making it succinctly. To Ali in London, Hafed in Washington, D.C., Ala in Benghazi, and Pratish in Johannesburg. Thanks to all of you, and of course, the hundreds of you who've called in the last few minutes. After the break, we're going to talk about bankers and whether they deserve to be punished further. I'm Ross Atkins. Thank you very much indeed for joining me for this week's World Have Your Say. Well, in the first half of the show, we discussed how and if the world should help Libya. And that conversation is carrying on at facebook.com/World Have Your Say. But for the next 30 minutes, we're going to talk about the big banks. According to a New York Times report that many of you have read, the US government is preparing to sue some of them because of their alleged inaccurate assessments of mortgage debt. You'll remember that bad debt in the US housing market was the seed from which the credit crunch grew. So do you feel the banks deserve further action for their practices in 2007 and 8? Or is further regulation and lawsuits the last thing the American or the global economy needs? If you are tweeting as you watch, as ever, use the WHYS hashtag. And if at any point you want to call us, the number is country code 44 2070 83 72 72. And if you call us, we'll call you back if you get on air. And even if you don't get on air, your comments may well be added to the stream that you see on the screen throughout the show. Now, let's take a look at the day's main news, starting with Turkey, which has expelled the Israeli ambassador and suspended their military agreements. This comes after Israel refused to apologise over its military action at a flotilla bound for Gaza last year. Israel said it acted in self-defence. The European Union has said it will impose a ban on oil imports from Syria. EU diplomats and officials argue the move will put pressure on the Syrian authorities over its violent crackdown on anti-government protesters. Libya's leaders are promising elections within months, but Colonel Gaddafi has urged his supporters to fight a guerrilla war against what he's calling the occupation of Libya. There's further evidence of a slowing of the US economy in new official figures which show there was no increase in the number of people with jobs last month. Share prices in New York have fallen in early trading, and Europe's main stock markets reacted by slumping sharply. The anti-secrecy website WikiLeaks has released its full archive of US embassy cables online. Many, if not all, of the posted documents appear to be unedited. They'll expose names and details of informants. WikiLeaks took the decision after the files became available online due to a security breach. Well, before we go and speak about the banks, let's quickly bring in Ben James from the World Have Your Say news desk, because we've had an extraordinary response to that discussion on Libya. Ben, come in here and tell us some of the things that people have been saying.
Well, you asked for South Africans to get in touch, and call in they did, like Charles from Belleville, who said South Africa was not represented at the meeting because Gaddafi supported the ANC for so many years. They feel indebted to him and they can't stand up to him, says Charles. Colin from Joburg called with a similar point, and Sharif in Port Elizabeth called to say he's proud to see democracy in Libya. Now, I was just speaking to Kule, who's a Nigerian who called in from Zawiya in Libya itself. He says Nigerians like him in Libya need help from the international community. He's lost his passport, he says he's been attacked, and he needs help to get home. And Leo in Paris called with a question: with international help from France, how does the panel think that it might change public perception of the West in Middle Eastern countries? And of course, you can always call in, but you can also tweet with the hashtag WHYS.
Thanks, Ben. I expect we'll speak to you later as we go through our banking discussion as well. Let me introduce you to our first three guests on this. Jerome Roos is a Dutch blogger in Italy. Professor Peter Morisi is from the Department of Logistics at the University of Maryland. He joins us live from Washington, D.C. And we're also joined by Nikki, who's a small business owner in the south of England. She's live with us from our Cambridge studio. Welcome to all three of you. Maybe I could start with you, Jerome. Do you welcome this report that the US government may sue the banks over what they did with the mortgage situation?
Well, I think any action to hold the banks to account for their role in having caused this crisis is very welcome. But we have to be very realistic here, and I think that a lot of this action is just far too little, far too late. Just 3 years ago, the U.S. government spent anywhere between $4 and $23 trillion in taxpayer money on saving the banks and preventing them from collapsing. And if you look at the few billions, a few tens of billions of dollars that are likely to be raised as a result of this litigation, you see that it truly pales in comparison to the amount of taxpayer money that has already been given away for free to the banks. So in that
so you support the move, saying there's money to be got back, and you feel that it's appropriate. I just wonder, Professor Morisi, if you agree with that analysis.
Well, the thing is the taxpayers would be trying to fetch back their own money. The taxpayers not only bailed out the big banks, but they also bailed out the government-run banks, what we call Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who are doing the suing. So you got one bailed-out bank trying to sue another bailed-out bank over the sins they both committed. And the other thing is, the caller amuses me. He says that we spent as taxpayers between $4 and $23 trillion. The gross national product of the United States is only $15 trillion. That means that everyone would have had to go without everything for a year and a half to come up with the money we gave the banks. We simply didn't give them that kind of money. It's important to recognize that the facts are getting exploded and exaggerated and re-exaggerated over time. More than that, if this suit were successful, it would not punish the very people who were responsible. It would basically punish American pensioners. Most of the stock in America is held by pension funds and people like that, and it's the stockholders of these banks who are fairly innocent bystanders who would be punished. This whole thing is
That's an interesting
absurd.
issue, and it's one that's been raised by a number of our viewers. Let's pull up this message from Matthew in Sydney, who posted on our Facebook page. It should be done in a way where we don't have to pay in the long run via high bank fees or higher taxes. And Professor Morisi, lots of our viewers are concerned about this, but is there a way of getting money out of banks without punishing people who don't deserve it?
Not really. The banks will charge higher fees. The real problem is the Treasury, headed by Tim Geithner, who was president of the New York Federal Reserve when all of this was happening, has been very disinclined to punish the real malefactors, and that is the officers in the big banks in New York. Goldman Sachs still has the same CEO it did before. He makes about $20 million a year. Jamie Dimon is still at J.P. Morgan, and Vikram Pandyan is still at Citigroup. I mean, the bottom line is the U.S. Treasury, which views itself as a democratic administration, it's supposed to be a people's administration, a working-class administration, simply is so pro-banker that the real malefactors aren't getting punished.
I'm interested to get our viewers to respond to this, because many of them have expressed frustration at the banks and how they've been dealt with since the credit crunch. But you're saying it's very difficult to punish them financially without hurting the wrong people. If you're watching and would like to respond to Professor Morisi, you can call us. It's country code 44 2070 83 72 72. Now, Nikki, you're a small business owner in Cambridge. I know you have some personal reasons for being frustrated with the banks. But what about the point Professor Morisi is making, that this kind of litigation may not deliver the punishment people like you are looking for?
Well, yes, I'd agree with him. I mean, I think part of the problem is there is no desire with any authorities to look at where the problem really stems from and to take action against the people who caused it. And it's very easy to just say blanket, let's fine a bank or let's sue a bank. But actually a bank is just a building, and it's the bankers who actually make the decisions inside that building. And we have exactly the same problem in this country, that nobody is prepared to really look at what happened and lay the blame where it should be. And it's not even a question of blame at this point, it's a question of it will happen again if there is no incentive for people not to behave like this. So I totally agree.
The CBI, which is an industry body in the UK, has been talking about this. I'll play you in a little while why they think more regulation, more constriction for the banks is a bad idea. But first of all, Nikki and Professor Morisi, let me introduce you to one more guest, because Jerome in Italy has left us. Let's speak to Alistair Heath. He's editor of City AM, which is a financial newspaper in London. Alistair, what would you like to add to what Nikki and Professor Morisi have been saying?
I think we're making a mistake here, and the mistake is to focus on just one part of what caused or who were responsible for the credit crisis and the bubble and the recession. The regulators and the central bankers were probably the #1 reason why we had this. In the US, there were actually laws promoting and official support for subprime lending, and now the very same authorities that actually helped to fuel this are now, trying to sue other parts of the problem. So I think we're making. I think the situation's quite bad in the sense that in the attempt to get closure from the crisis, the wrong lessons are being learned. You need to change the whole system, including what the central banks do, what the regulators do, and what the authorities do. And if you deny that that is a problem, as the people who are currently doing the suing are effectively doing, then that's a big mistake, and you're not actually going to change the system, and you're not actually going to prevent another crisis. So I think these lawsuits, to be honest, they're trivial. They will obviously affect the share price, the share prices of these big banks. They will hit the shareholders. As one of the guests said before, the current shareholders are not actually the previous shareholders, so you're punishing a completely different set of people, and they will increase the cost of credit. They won't really achieve much. What is needed is systemic change in economic policy, in macroeconomic policy. Mm-hmm. You've got to stop this situation where the authorities say they will constantly bail out bad decisions, subsidise bad decisions, and effectively socialise risk. I think that's what caused a crisis, this massive moral hazard.
And as I was saying, if you want to speak to any of our guests, those of you watching, if you want to speak to any of our guests, let me quickly play you what the CBI has been saying, and then Professor Morisi, I'll certainly give you a chance to jump in. This is John Cridland saying why he feels more regulation may have a detrimental effect in the UK.
The economy is now sluggish. So do we want to make it harder for banks at this precise moment to get money into the hands of small businesses? Because mark this, the reality of a big structural change to the way Britain's banks are organised is that they will be less able to lend to small businesses in Britain.
Professor Morisi, your reaction to that?
Well, I think that over-regulation is indeed a great problem in both the United States and Britain. It's not that we don't want to regulate the banks properly, but just adding layer on top of layer of ineffective regulation is not the answer. The banking industry needs a fundamental restructuring. In America, the banks are too large and they do too many different things. We need to get back to simply having depositories make loans and that's it, and being smaller in size. But that is not likely to happen for a variety of reasons in the United States. We really do need, as the previous caller said, the speaker one before, fundamental systemic reform, and these lawsuits aren't going to bring that about.
I mean, the debate we should be having is about what kind of reform we should have. And in fairness, there's been massive amounts of reform already. The entire system has changed quite substantially, but it's not changed enough in certain ways. And I think, to me, the big way it should change is you should abolish this moral hazard. You should abolish this belief that the authorities are always going to step in.
Let me ask you a question about that. Are you willing to let Greece and Italy default on their bonds instead of bailing them out?
Oh, I'm on the record for saying Greece should absolutely default, yes. Greece is bankrupt.
And Italy,
but this is obviously a different issue, but it's part of the same problem.
No, it's not. It's the very same kind of issue. It's the very same kind of issue. If you're against bailing people out in the United States, are you against bailing folks out in
yes,
Europe?
that's the answer to your question.
Okay.
And the problem, we've lived far too long now on the premise that everybody should be bailed out all the time. If you do that, you end up creating more and more risk, more and more moral hazard, and a catastrophe. Just another bubble down the road. You've got to reform the system to allow orderly bankruptcies, to allow these big institutions to be wound down in a detailed, careful way which doesn't take down bystanders. And that's, I think, the big challenge. And the kind of thing you're seeing at the moment won't help.
Alistair, Professor Maurizi, let me jump in there, and Nikki as well. We're going to take a quick break. If you want to respond to what you're hearing, remember you can tweet us using the WHYS hashtag or post at facebook.com/worldhaveyoursay. I'll be back in a moment. Hi there, Ros Atkins here with you on World Have Your Say. We're talking about how the banks should be dealt with in terms of lawsuits and regulation after a New York Times story that the US government is considering suing some of the major banks over how they dealt with mortgages. And of course, I won't need to remind you that it was the mortgage situation in the US economy which led to the much bigger global credit crunch. Well, still with us live from Washington, D.C. is Professor Peter Maurizi from the University of Maryland. We also have Alistair Heath from the City AM newspaper in London, and Nikki, a small business owner in Cambridge in the UK, is with us live as well. Let me read all three of you this message on our Facebook page from Patricia Ann, who writes, "They had no remorse and gave top officials enormous bonuses once they had received their bailouts. They are not suffering any loss of lifestyle." Nikki, is that how you feel?
Yes, to a certain extent. I mean, I think what's going on now is there's all this talk about reform and whether or not we will get banking reform in the UK. I'm not sure about America. But as far as I can see, the only thing that we know for sure is that the bankers themselves have been ring-fenced, and they've been ring-fenced from all responsibility and all morals and really from the law and from society and definitely from reality. And until we tackle that problem, and I'm not saying all bankers are bad because that would be a ridiculous statement, but I can say that I know that some bankers have been extremely reckless and literally ruined hundreds of thousands of lives,
Alistair,
and nothing has been done about
Alistair,
it. Absolutely nothing.
Are your readers ring-fenced from reality? Do they understand they've ruined hundreds of thousands of lives?
Well, obviously there have been thousands of job losses in the banking industry, for example, in the last few months, so not everybody is ring-fenced. I think, I obviously support a lot of reform. It is a case that there has been a lot of reform in the banking industry already. For example, they've got to hold 3-4 times more capital than they used to. That was one of the reasons these banks went bust when things went wrong. But I think the problem is much greater. It's very easy to focus on part of the problem. The biggest decisions have gone unnoticed, almost unremarked, especially in the UK. For example, policies by governments and central banks to deliberately reduce interest rates to fuel housing bubbles because politicians wanted higher house prices. But let's not forget, millions of people gained from that too.
Alistair, wouldn't it be helpful, though, if the people who buy your newspaper, many of whom are bankers, said sorry? It's very hard to find any banker who will come onto any programme, World Have Your Say or any other, and say, we really, really messed up here. They all seem to blame someone else.
Perhaps, but I'm not a banker, I'm a journalist, and I am very critical of all errors, so I just want to make that clear. But the point basically is that everybody who was responsible should say sorry. The central bankers, the regulators, the bankers, the people who borrowed money knowing they couldn't pay it back, and so on. This was a general social failure. The whole system failed, the whole society
let's
failed.
take a quick comment from Professor Maurizi, and then Eduardo's coming in from Portugal.
It would be very nice to have them all say they were wrong, but I don't think that's going to change anything fundamentally. I think we have to remove some people from their positions and change their lifestyles, and so that they do pay some kind of price. We don't have to throw them in jail. But if you took Jamie Dimon and you fired him at J.P. Morgan and you said, I'm sorry, you not only must leave J.P. Morgan, but you can never head a major bank again, that would be a major come down in his life, and that would send a very powerful message to other bank executives.
No sign that's going to happen, though. Let's bring in Eduardo, who's on Skype from Porto in Portugal. Eduardo, what's your view of this?
Well, I think that the main question is being unanswered, because the thing is, the money is not the issue. Even if the government is suing for $30 billion, it's not the issue, the money, but the trust of the shareholders. I think the people in the position that should have made better decisions should be left out should be thrown out of their positions and be held accountable. And that's the only way that shareholders will gain trust in the banking system again. And that's being forgotten, because the shares are not dropping. The shares are not dropping because of the millions that they might be paying afterwards. It's dropping because they don't trust.
Well, at the moment, the shares are dropping across Europe and America, but that's primarily to do with the fact there are no new jobs being created at the moment. That's just been announced in the States. Eduardo, thanks for speaking to us from Portugal. Dr. Maurizi in Washington, D.C., Alistair Heath in London, Nikki in Cambridge. We appreciate your contributions. We've also had calls from Spain, Sierra Leone, Vietnam, Greece and India. We'll speak to some more of you on World Have Your Say Extra in a few hours' time, and on BBC World Service Radio in an hour's time. But for the moment, thank you very much indeed for your company. World Have Your Say next week will be live from Manhattan ahead of the 10th anniversary of 9/11. Speak to you very soon. Goodbye.